And to focus on this, we'll start looking at what is the bargaining unit determination. And so if we think about this in terms of perhaps the automotive United Auto Workers, right? So if I'm negotiating salary levels, should I be negotiating hourly pay rates for my union members? Should I be negotiating that at a national level, or should it be at a state level, or should it be at a factory level, or customer? Is it General Motors versus Ford versus any of the Dodge, any of the large automakers that have CBAs in place? So what is the right bargaining unit determination? We want to talk about the union structure, right? So is it a craft union? Is it a skilled labor union, or is it an unskilled labor union, or is it all labor in a particular industry, whether they're skilled or unskilled? So what is the union structure that's being considered? Then we want to talk about that same bargaining unit determination in the public sector. We want to talk some about public sector unions, essentially union structures in public sectors, and then the organizing drive, or how do we create a union, and what is acceptable, or what are acceptable and legal behaviors on both the employee or union and employer side. We're also going to talk about union organizing strategies. We're going to talk about the union avoidance strategies that management may try to put into place to keep unions out of their shop. And then we're going to talk about the actual election procedures around determining employee representation. And so when we talk about the appropriate bargaining unit, we're really talking about the group of employees that's determined by the National Labor Relations Board to be the appropriate unit for collective bargaining purposes. And there are really no strict rules by which this is enforced. The board is not required to choose the most appropriate unit, only an appropriate unit, right? And so there are no hard and fast rules on this to determine appropriateness, although there are several limitations on the types of units and on workers to be included and excluded. The National Labor Relations Board generally follows certain fundamental and logical policies in determining what an appropriate unit is. And so then after this bargaining unit has been determined, the employees of that unit have the right to select their bargaining representatives, which are usually a labor union. And so the bargaining unit is defined as the particular group of employees represented by the union in collective bargaining. The union has exclusive bargaining rights for all employees within the unit, whether they join the union or not, and has no rights for those employees outside of the bargaining unit. The basic underlying principle for the National Labor Relations Board's determination of an appropriate unit is that only employees having a substantial mutuality of interest in wages, hours, and working conditions can be appropriately grouped in that unit. And so with respect to the appropriateness of the unit, the logic is that the greater the similarities of working conditions, the greater the likelihood the unit's members can agree on priorities and thus make the collective bargaining process successful. And the criteria that's most often used in deciding what constitutes a rational unit include community of interest, the history of bargaining, the desire of employees, prior unionization, relationship of the unit to the organizational structure, and public interest. And so as we talked earlier, particularly when we were talking about the private sector, the terms of employment will generally include items like the price of labor, right? So we know what we're going to get paid and we know what benefits. We know what our work rules are, right? So we have some expectation of who we report to, what that reporting chain looks like. Then we know what our hours of work are. We know what we're being hired as. What is their job classification? Along with that job classification comes a job description, right? And then we also know that there is an enforcement and administrative procedures around that unit, right? And we also know that there are management and union rights in accordance with the CBA, or the collective bargaining agreement. And so it's again, when we're trying to determine what the appropriate bargaining unit is, we look for some mutuality of interest amongst all of these different categories. And that makes sense when you think about it, right? So if I'm negotiating, and that's essentially what the bargaining unit then becomes, it's that group of employees who then go on to elect a representative to negotiate their contract. Well, if we're negotiating a contract for a group of people like that, we want there to be a lot of mutuality of interest so that we can strike a reasonable agreement that all of, and it's unlikely all of them will, but most would agree with and support, versus having disparate workers with such disparate characteristics regarding some of these items that, it's fair to one group but unfair to another. And so when we talk about this idea of an appropriate bargaining unit criteria, we talk in terms of the, what is most useful about what a rational unit would be. And so we talk about this community of interest, right? So it attempts to quantify by means of descriptive criteria when workers should feel that their individual interests are so similar that collective bargaining would be fruitful. We talk about this history of bargaining. So if the bargaining unit and a particular employer have a history of bargaining, the board will recognize the appropriateness of the unit in the absence of compelling reasons to the contrary to ensure the employee's right of self-organization and, most importantly, to provide a climate of stable labor relations. We look at employee wishes. The global doctrine, which was established by the National Labor Relations Board policy to give weight to employee wishes when determining an appropriate bargaining unit. Although the board cannot delegate the selection of the bargaining unit to employees, it may use the election process as a way to consult employees. We also talk in terms of employee unionization, right? So the NLRB considers the extent of unionization by a bargaining unit as one factor in unit determination, but not as a controlling factor. The question really still is one of appropriateness, not of whether the wishes of a union can be monitored. The unit employer organizational structure is also another criteria. And so there we're talking the considerations to determine appropriateness are not legally binding formulas, but an exercise of a rational examination of the facts of the individual case. The NRLB recognized these distinctions from its earliest decisions. One consideration added by the courts for review by the board is the public interest. Without much guidance provided by the courts, the board is to ascertain when its decision will serve the public interest. Accreditation. So when new employees or positions are added by an employer, accretion follows the NLRB to consider adding the new groups of employees directly to existing units if their work satisfies the same criteria as the original unit, that is, community of interest, bargaining history, interchange of employees, geographic proximity, common supervision, and union wishes. However, such a determination is not automatic. If the new class of employees retains a separate identity, perhaps by virtue of its newness, it cannot be determined an additional appropriate unit. Accretion usually occurs when an employer expands operations, builds a new facility, or merges with another employer. So it's often to the advantage of the union to have accretion since it adds more employees to the bargaining unit. So sometimes accretion offers the board a conflicting choice. Adding new employees to an established unit preserves the stability so important under the Act, but squeezing in new employees under perhaps narrower similarities constricts the employee's freedom of choice. Stipulated units. This pertains to the board's authority to determine an appropriate unit and it is not without limitations. The company and a union may stipulate to the board what they consider an appropriate unit. The courts have said that the board may not alter the bargaining unit in such cases. However, a stipulated unit may not violate principles in the NLRA or establish board policy. And then supervisors. Supervisors, by the nature of their work, generally are considered management under the NLRA and thus excluded from any bargaining unit or from collective bargaining rights granted under the Act. So as the workplace has become more complex and jobs more varied, the exact definition of a supervisor has become an issue debated in Congress by labor experts. The NLRA defines a supervisor as someone using independent judgment to assign and direct the work of other employees in the interest of the employer. And so again, what we're talking about here is, what are the criteria that are used by the NLRB in determining what is the appropriate bargaining unit? Then we talk about the types of units. right? So we could have craft units, and those are workers whose jobs primarily require a recognized skill. So those would be examples would be electricians or machinists or plumbers. So with recognition questions for crafts unit usually come before the board when a group of craft employees wants to break away from an existing industrial union, which included many different job skills, which is called that act of that breaking away is called craft severance. And so Congress has established a policy that the board cannot determine a craft unit inappropriate on the grounds that a different unit has been established by prior board determination unless the majority of the employees in the craft unit vote against separate representation. Then we also have the idea that that the NLRB requires that the craft group be distinct from others in the unit by virtue of the skilled, non-repetitive nature of the work. The board examines the extent to which the group has retained its identity or, as the alternative, actually participated in the affairs of the larger unit. We may also have departmental units. They're similar to a craft unit, except that they are composed of all the members of one department in a larger organization. The board uses standards similar to those used for craft severance in determining one department to be an appropriate unit separate from the entire plant or company. We may have one employer, multiple locations. Many employers have plants, facilities, or stores at more than one location, and the NLRB must determine if a single location can be the appropriate unit or whether all locations should constitute a single unit. It's well established that a petition for a single facility unit is presumed to be an appropriate bargaining unit. The presumption, however, is rebuttable if we can show that the single facility has so effectively merged into a more comprehensive unit or is so functionally integrated that it has lost its separate identity. Then we have multi-employer units. And so although the Wagner Act favors localizing a unit within one employer, collective bargaining can be conducted between a group of related employers and representatives of their employees. Factors to be considered in such designation are whether there is an express or implied approval of all parties to enter into such bargaining relationships. The employer can withdraw from the multi-employer collective bargaining relationship before the date for modification or negotiation of a new contract. And so these multi-employer plans I've seen in place at government facilities where you may have certain, particularly where we're talking about privatization of a previous government effort, and so it's privatized, which means it's outsourced to contractors, and this is the multi-employer units. But the contractors, the employees are all under the same previous government plan, right? So they all are under the same previous government plan, and the contractors must offer in order to participate in the contract must offer comparable benefits. And so what happens is these contractors will all get together and execute a multi-employer pension agreement, which says all of these employees in this location are covered by all of these government contractors, and all of these employees, even though they are employed by different government contractors because they were prior government employees with a set of benefits, same benefits, all have to receive comparable benefits or the offering of comparable benefits, and this is accomplished through the use of a multi-employer pension plan or multi-employer collective bargaining agreement. And then finally we have this idea of residual units, which come about when workers do not always fit into neat packages. So the board sometimes has given additional recognition to odd collections of employees because of their common working situations or the proximity of their working sites. We also have this idea of remaining units. So employee groups that are separate from primary production and maintenance units can be classified as remaining units. Because of the exclusions contained in the Act itself, professional employees and guards often have professional and guard units. Technical units contain employees with a high degree of skill and training who exercise independent judgment but fall short of professional skills. It often becomes a question of who should be included on the basis of the level of skill or training, employee contact and interchange, and similarity of working conditions. Construction industry units really come about because of the unusual nature of the U.S. construction industry, that is, with respect to seasonal work, temporary work, or project-based work. So in the construction industry, an employer may begin to bargain with the union before any employees are hired for a new project. The union, unlike unions in other industries, is not required to show it represents the majority of the employees in the appropriate bargaining unit before it bargains with the employer. And then we have healthcare institutional units. And so the 1974 healthcare amendments extended coverage of the Act to employees of non-profit hospitals. So the units covered under the healthcare institutional units are generally one of 8 basic appropriate healthcare units, and they include physicians, registered nurses or RNs, all other professional employees including licensed practical nurses, technical employees, business office clerical employees, skilled maintenance employees, guards, and all other non-professional employees. So the structure of unions, labor unions, reflects the reasons they were formed and the influences of the times in which they grew. Unions seek to secure better living standards for their members through higher wages and fringe benefits, and to enhance job security through tenure, layoff provisions, and seniority rights. To meet the union's objective, a 2-tiered labor organizational structure has evolved. On the local level, job-oriented units form the basis for bargaining with employers. On the national level, a network or federation of unions pursues broader goals. And so when we talk about the types of unions under a union structure, we're really talking about this idea of craft unions. And so these are made up of workers who have been organized in accordance with their craft or skill. One craft, one union is their slogan. For example, in the building construction industry, skilled workers include electricians, carpenters, bricklayers, iron workers. In the printing industry, we may have printers, typesetters, engravers. In the service industry, there may be barbers, cooks, telephone workers. In manufacturing, there could be millwrights, machinists, tool and die makers. The craft union, as an organization of skilled workers, is able to approach an employer on a much different footing than the industrial union. The craft union local typically seeks to organize all practitioners of its trade employed by a certain employer or within a specific geographical area. By doing so successfully, the craft union creates a union shop. Employers who need the services of skilled labor must employ a union member. Craft unions also seek to restrict the supply of skilled labor so they can demand higher wages. Stringent apprenticeships programs consisting of several years of classroom instruction and on-the-job training limit craft union membership. State or local licensing board composed of members of the trade union can often restrict the number of state licenses issued. Industrial unions are generally composed of unskilled and semi-skilled workers or all of the non-management personnel in a plant or facility, and due to their numbers often have a wider and stronger base than craft unions. For these unions, the slogan "One Shop, One Union" typifies the industrial union. The industrial union seeks to increase membership to ensure its influence. So typically, industrial unions include organizations of auto workers, rubber workers, textile workers, commercial workers, steel workers, miners, and truck drivers, although increasingly government employees such as firefighters, police, and hospital workers are organizing industrial-type unions. However, a study of industrial unions' organizing efforts in recent years revealed that they have transitioned into more general unions as they have sought to expand their memberships outside their traditional industry. Members of an industrial union often join the union after being hired simply because of a provision in a collective bargaining agreement. The members regard their union as their voice with the employer, and when employment ends, their membership usually ends as well. So we essentially have 4 different levels of unions, and they are local unions, national or international unions, intermediate unions, and the Federation of Unions. When we talk about local unions, we talk that unionized workers are members of a local union and its organized component of the labor union. It handles the day-to-day operations of the collective bargaining agreement. The local union usually meets once a month to conduct business, and at these meetings we have annual elections, some union issues are discussed, and activities are organized. Although the level is most important to its member, attendance at the union meetings varies and is highest at times of crisis. Unlike paid business agents for craft unions, elected officials of local industrial unions are compensated by given being given time off the job when conducting union business. Then we have local officers. These are officers of local unions, and they are usually elected positions for fixed terms. The position often include president, vice president, a secretary, a sergeant at arms, and a business manager or agent, and a steward. The local officers serve on the negotiating committee with other members elected by the membership or chosen by the officers. This role on the negotiating committee is their most important, and when two slates of candidates run for officer's position, how well they perform at the bargaining table may determine which slate is selected. And so this is just an example of the bylaws of a local union, and it's on page 129 of your text. And really what it usually does, these bylaws specify a local union's jurisdiction, their meetings process, the elections process, as well as the duties and salaries of the officers. So then we have the third union structure, which deals with national or international unions. And so it's typically, but not always the case, the local union is affiliated with one of these national or international unions. Craft and industrial unions organize on a national basis and designate local units by region. The national union serves as the local's parent, having created it, but the local union is considered a separate and distinct voluntary association owing its existence to the will of its members. The national union provides services to the locals, and the fundamental relationship is based on the services rendered. Services may include organizing the non-union workers within the jurisdiction of the local union. In appropriate circumstances, the national union negotiates master agreements with nationwide employers and then assists the local union in negotiating a local agreement. Even if no national contract is entered into, the national union assists the local unions in their contract negotiations through research and educational services and may provide an expert negotiator. And then finally, we have this intermediate organizational unions, which consist of regional or district officers, trade councils, conference boards, and joint councils, which lie between the national and local unions. For industrial unions, the intermediate office serves to bring the national office closer to the local unions to provide better services. For craft unions, joint councils often bring the various crafts together to give them a better negotiating power with local construction employers to coordinate their activities and to assist in resolving jurisdictional disputes between craft unions. And so from 1955, when the American Federation of Labor, AFL, and the Congress of Industrial Unions, the CIO, merged to create the AFL-CIO until 2005, the AFL-CIO was the only federation of unions in the United States. However, 7 national unions split from the AFL-CIO to create Change to Win in 2005. So the AFL-CIO is composed of 56 national and international unions, has approximately 39,000 local units and 10.5 million members, including plumbers, machinists, teachers, musicians, engineers, bottlers, firefighters, editors, and farm workers. Although the AFL-CIO is itself not a union, it represents U.S. labor in world affairs and coordinates union activities such as lobbying, voter registration, and political education. And so this example shows us the AFL-CIO structure, right? And so we see that in the center of the example are the services that the AFL-CIO offers with respect to civil, human, and women's rights, collective bargaining, the field support, governmental affairs support, international support, public affairs support, and then we see that those services are offered through the Executive Council, which reports to the 56 affiliated units. And then we also see that the AFL-CIO is made up of thousands of affiliated local unions and 10.5 million people. And then we see some of the specific programs that the AFL-CIO sponsors, like Working America, the National Labor College, Union Privileges, Alliance for Retired Americans, and so on and so forth. But again, this just kind of is meant to show how this very large type of organization, federation of unions, operates. And so, as we said, an alternative to the AFL-CIO is Change to Win, and that is comprised of 7 national unions that split from the AFL-CIO. And this new union federation of national unions, which is dedicated to growing their memberships through strategic organizational campaign and improving the living standards of workers. The 3 unions that led the split were the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the Service Employees International Union, and the United Food and Commercial Workers. The new federation started with 6 million members and elected Anna Berger as the first woman in history to lead a labor union in the United States. In 2010, Change to Win represented over 5.5 million members and was known for aggressive organizational campaigns. So then we have independent units, and as we said earlier, not all local unions are affiliated with a national or an international unit that in turn is a part of the AFL-CIO or Change to Win. Local independent units are characterized by smaller memberships, more limited funds, and a lower profile. Independent unions are generally not designed along either the craft or the industrial unit modeling, preferring to open their membership to employees of specific professional occupations. So now we'll switch gears a little and talk about public sector unions. And with public sector unions, we also have the same issue that deals with what's the appropriate bargaining unit. And so, borrowing from court decisions under the National Labor Relations Act, the federal law applies a community of interest test to identify an appropriate unit on an agency, plan, installation, functional, or other basis. At the federal level, confidential employees, managers, supervisors, and personnel employees are excluded from the bargaining unit. Professional employees are excluded from non-professional units unless the professional employees vote in favor of their own inclusion. And some examples of these are the National Education Association, which you may recall we said was the largest union in the world, the International Association of Firefighters, the American Federation of Government Employees, and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And in some cases, these unions really are rooted in professional organizations that existed prior to the growth of unions in the public side. If we talk about the organizing drive, which really is a movement initiated by dissatisfied employees or union organizers to submit a representation petition to the National Labor Relations Board and win a representation election, thus providing union certification and collective bargaining. And this is either in the private sector or the public sector, this organizing drive, right? And so this, as we said, it can really originate in either of 2 general sources. First, the workers could be dissatisfied with pay or work conditions, or they could also be generated as a result of a union organizer who is really just a full-time salaried staff member who generally represents a national union who contacts workers. And then, as the title suggests, the union organizers increase union membership and strength by organizing groups of workers who are not presently unionized. And so, again, you could have a group of disgruntled employees who initiate an organizing drive, or you could have one of these national unions contact employees and say you should be unionized, and this would be the benefits to you as a group of employees of being unionized. And so that would be a way of initiating the organizing drive. And so this shows the series of events which happen in the in the case of an organizing drive. So the goal, obviously, for the union is to organize workers and bring them into the union. Labor strategy is to convince the workers that union membership will bring them benefits they do not presently enjoy. Union organizers may suggest that union representation result in higher pay, more benefits, better working conditions, greater fairness in promotions, job transfers, or layoffs, because these are the things that are important to employees, right? And so then, speaking proudly of the benefits and work accomplishments they've achieved for other workers, union organizers often cite impressive and convincing statistics about wage gains achieved through collective bargaining. If management's goal is to keep the union out of the workplace, then its strategy may be to convince the workers that unionization will do them more harm than good. They may attempt to ensure workers that present pay and benefits are competitive and can show data to prove that. They may emphasize the philosophy and history of fair dealings with all employees, and they may discuss the union's involvement in violent or corrupt activities if that happens to be the case, to discredit the union. But in the organizing process itself, we see that either the initial contact is by employees of the union organizer, and that's the very top square. If it's the union creates the strategy to organize, once that contact has happened, the union then creates the strategy to organize, and management creates a strategy to keep the union out. Then we move down into a representative election by the members. And this may be voluntary recognition, or it may be an NLRB directive under the Gissel doctrine, which we'll talk about. And this representation election is followed by 3 steps: the petition, the investigation and campaigns by both sides, and then a secret ballot election. And after that secret ballot election, either the union would be certified or the union is rejected. If the union is certified, then we move into the first contract bargaining or collective bargaining agreement effort or phase. So when we talk about union organizing strategies, we see that there are several steps involved. So they'll build an organizing committee, and that is, they'll identify leaders and establish an organizing committee representing all major departments and shifts which reflect the racial, ethnic, and gender diversity in the workplace. Right, and this organizing committee is then educated about the workers' right to organize and understand their union's policies and principles of democracy and rank and file control. Also at this step, the basic information about the workplace has to be gathered, and those are include items or information on the organizational structure, the information about the employees, employer data and financial information, work issues of concern, and so on. Then the union organization has to determine the issues. So the committee develops a program of union demands, that is, the improvements that they are organizing to achieve, and a strategy for the union recognition plan. A plan for highlighting the issues to the workers is carried out through various organizing campaign activities. Then they have to choose a union recognition strategy, and that needs to be chosen either a card check recognition, so the organizing committee and or the representatives from the union informs the employer that a sizable majority, at least 50% plus one person, but ideally 60% or more, has signed union authorization cards. If they're successful, the employer voluntarily agrees to reconcile the union or recognize the union as a legal bargaining agent for the designated bargaining unit. Or they strike for recognition, and that is that a sizable majority may agree to a short strike to force the employer to recognize the union. If this is successful, the employer voluntarily agrees to recognize the union as the legal bargaining agent for the designated bargaining unit. And then finally, they could call for an NLRB-sponsored election. And this is where the organizing committee convinces co-workers to sign union authorization cards. And this is really the most common of the 3 strategies, with the goal being to sign up a majority of the workers. However, really they only need 30% of the workforce to sign these authorization cards to qualify for an NLRB-sponsored election. This card campaign should proceed quickly. Once begun, it's necessary to hold a union election. Then, after they've chosen the union recognition strategy, they have to move into the union recognition status. So to hold an NLRB sponsored secret ballot election, the signed authorization cards are required to petition the state or federal labor board to hold an election. And so this step 4 is only necessary if the card check recognition or the strike for recognition wasn't invoked or wasn't successful, so that where the employer did not voluntarily agree to recognize the union as the legal bargaining agent. And then in this organizing strategy, we also have the idea of salting. And so in response to union membership decline, unions in recent years initiated a program called salting. And this is where union members are encouraged to seek employment with target companies that are not unionized. The union members receive permission from the union through salting resolutions to work non-union without being subject to disciplinary action by their union. There are really 3 types of salting. First, in cases in which union jobs are not available, the union members are urged to seek employment at non-union companies on their own time. They talk to their fellow workers about the benefits of unionization. In these cases, the union members are not compensated. The second type of salting is where union members seek employment with non-union companies at the request of the union. Again, on their own time, they promote unionization. As compensation, the union supplements the regular pay they get from employer to equal a union wage. And then the third type of salting is when regular full-time employees of a union seek employment with a non-union company for the sole reason of organizing the workers. The union makes up the difference between their organizer's pay and what the employer pays the employees of the union while being employed at the non-union company. So essentially what we say about salting is that we get somebody into the non-union organization by one of these three different practices in order to get discussions around unionization started. And so then we talk about union avoidance strategies by management, because by and large, of course, management doesn't want unions to, they don't want to become unionized because they are then, they have less flexibility, as we talked about some of the pros and cons from a management standpoint of unions, right? In many workplaces, management's goal is to simply keep the union out. And they do this by convincing the workers that unionization will do them more harm than good. And we talked about examples of that where maybe they could show the corrupt union activities before, or they could show that wages are competitive and so that employees would not really be receiving much in the way of benefit of a union, right? But their goal is to convince workers they really don't need a union because they're not going to be better off as a result of having one. And these are all strategies that can be employed by management to keep or to avoid unions. And so when management when they become aware that there are unionization threats on the floor, then there are certain things they can do and certain things they can't do. And so one of the some acronyms that help managers keep in mind what they may and may not do, and these are all according to National Labor Relations Act or the public sector version of that, and we refer to the things that they cannot do as tips. So don't threaten or imply the company will take adverse actions. Don't threaten to terminate employees. Don't threaten to close the facility. Don't threaten to transfer the employees. Don't threaten employees with loss of their jobs. There's a list of these items that managers cannot do. And when we talk about tips, what we're talking about is threaten, interrogate, promise, and spy. And so there are a list of activities that cannot be done, should not be done with respect to threatening, interrogating, promising, or spying by managers. And then we have this idea of 4, and these are the things managers may do, right? And they deal with facts, opinions, roles, and experience. So things that managers can do to discourage unionization: 4, facts, opinion, rules, and experience. And they include things like do tell employees that by signing a union authorization card, they may have authorized the union to become their legal representatives. Do tell them that if they sign this card, it does not mean that they must vote for the union in an election, and that an election is a secret balanced process. Do tell them that they can actively campaign against the union. You just cannot help them in any manner. With respect to opinion, do tell employees that management does not believe that the employees need third-party representation, and tell employees that management believes in the open door policy and are willing to discuss any subject with them. And then for rules, right, do tell employees that the law permits the company to permanently replace them if there is a strike, and do tell employees that the union cannot make the company agree to anything it does not want to during negotiations. And then with respect to the E or experience, share personal experiences that you as a manager may have had with unionized workplace. And obviously, the preferable time to do this is to not wait until there's a threat of unionization, but to be transparent and open with employees about what is their pay and why is their pay what it is and how competitive is their pay, and what are their benefits and how competitive are their benefits, and so that employees treat employees fairly, treat employees with respect, do all the things and the treatments and the approaches that sound business practices say we should do before we get to a point that we're threatened with unionization. And then there are these ideas of counter-salting steps, right? So these are, once we become aware that someone is in our organization under one of these salting approaches, there are some counter salting steps that employers have taken, and those are, one is to pre-screen as many applicants as possible to ensure you're not hiring the most qualified person for any opening you have available. The National Labor Relations, that you are hiring the most qualified person for any openings you have available. The NLRA prohibits an employer from refusing to hire an applicant because of his or her union affiliation. However, the law does not prevent a company from selecting the most positive, dedicated, and enthusiastic applicant available. Use consensus interviewing. Several members of management should interview applicants and then compare notes and recommendations for hiring. You may also, an application may say list entire employment history starting with present employer. For any unemployed or self-employed period, show dates and locations. If there are only 3 spaces on the application to list existing or former employees, ask applicants if they have completed their entire employment history, and if not, ask them to attach additional sheets. And this will give the employer some insight as to whether they're coming from or have been in a union shop before. And then check references thoroughly and ensure that applicants. And this is just a repeat of some of the issues we said with counter-salting steps, right? So the right to engage in organizational campaigns in and around the workplace obviously affects the employer's right to maintain a work environment. The NLRB and the courts have devised rules to balance the two entities. So with respect to soliciting union support, employees on their own time, even on the employer's property, can solicit union support by talking about the union. And that includes lunchtime, break time, rest periods, and before and after the regular workday. A non-employee, usually a union organizer, does not have the right to solicit union support on the employer's property if there is any other means to reach the employees. And these other means include things like distributing union material. So distribution of union material is restricted to non-working times and areas because such litter could clutter the workplace. However, no rule is without exceptions. Examples include department stores, restaurants, and patient care areas of hospitals where the public nature of the working area would prohibit normal interaction between employees so that leaving literature is allowed. Employees may wear union buttons or insignias. Employees have no statutory right to use an employer's bulletin board, meeting halls, or mailboxes. However, if the employees are allowed access to the bulletin board, the employer cannot censor the material to include or to exclude union solicitation. Employees may use company email for discussions relating to hours, wages, and working conditions, assuming that does not violate a legitimate employer policy regarding the use of work time or equipment. And the employer may implement a no solicitation or non-use discrimination policy for both employees and non-employees during work or non-work hours at the workplace and restrict the use of bulletin boards, meeting halls, emails, and mailboxes if that policy extends to all types of solicitations. So during an organizational campaign, the target employer is the primary employer, and under the Act, the union can picket a primary employer, but only for 30 days before being required to file a petition for an election with the NLRB. Mass picketing, violence, or threats of violence are not allowed, nor is a secondary picketing. That's picketing a neutral party in order to have that neutral party pressure the targeted employer on the union's behalf. If the employer shares premises with other neutral employers in informational picketing, that is simply informing the public that the target employer does not pay union wages. And then we have the representation elections, right? There are 3 different methods by which a union may become a representative of the group of employees for the purpose of collective bargaining. The most common is the secret ballot election. And why is that? And because it's been called by supporters the gold standard of providing employees freedom of choice as to whether or not they want union representation. The secret ballot representation election is described here. And so we have representation petition. The first step is the election process is to file a representation petition at the office of the appropriate regional director. The union must present evidence of employee support before a representation election is held. The NLRB requires designation by at least 30% of the bargaining unit employees, usually in the form of a signed and dated authorization card. And then the NLRB also accepts designation in the form of signed petitions and union cards. An employee, a group of employees, or a union representing employees can file an RC petition seeking certification of an appropriate unit. An employer can file an RM petition if one or more labor organizations claim representation status in an appropriate unit and the employer questions the representative status. Also, when an employer has objective proof that the union no longer represents the majority of the employer, he or she may file an RM petition. An employer, employee, other individual, or union may also use a decertification or RD petition to determine whether a recognized union still has the support of employees. And so the second step is this investigation, and that occurs when the regional director conducts investigations and a hearing if necessary to determine whether to proceed with an election. The employer's business must sufficiently affect commerce so as to rest jurisdiction in the NLRB. An actual representation question must exist and sufficient employee interest must be demonstrated. Certain statutory time privileges must also be honored. And so then we move into, after the investigation, step 3, and that's the secret ballot election. So the NLRB has the responsibility to ensure that a representative election is fairly and honestly conducted. In a 1948 case, the board stated that its function in representative proceedings was to provide a laboratory in which an experiment may be conducted under conditions as nearly ideal as possible to determine the uninhibited desires of the employee. The NLRB has traditionally favored direct or manual ballots, that's voting machines, voting boxes, over mail ballots in representational elections. The board's policy has been to use only mail ballots when manual ballots are infeasible. Manual ballots are often favored because they have greater secrecy, the integrity of the voting process is greater, there's an apparent absence of coercion, and greater participation by employees. And so then in step 4, if the board is satisfied that the election represents the employee's free choice, the election is certified, which is this 4th step. Either no union is victorious, or if a union has gained a majority of those voting, that union is certified as a bargaining agent for the unit. If, however, the NLRB finds that the pre-election period did not meet the laboratory conditions doctrine as it is enunciated in the General Shoe case, then the election result can be declared void. The NLRB describes laboratory conditions during the pre-election period as those that provide employees an atmosphere in which they have a free choice of being represented by a bargaining representative or not. In addition, the NLRB has found that actions that violate the laboratory conditions fall into 3 categories: coercion, threats of reprisal, and promises of benefits. And so this idea of certification benefits a union in a number of ways. It closes any challenges to the union status as the exclusive bargaining agent for the particular unit. Its status is binding on the employer for at least 1 year, during which the employer must bargain with it. After the 1st year, the employer must continue to bargain unless there's reasonable doubt that the union will continue to enjoy a majority vote of the union. The board will not entertain petitions regarding rival certification for that unit within 1 year certification or within 3 years of the valid contract is in effect. The certified union may strike against the employer under certain circumstances without fear of an unfair labor practice charge. So then we have this idea of voluntary recognition, and remember we said that under a card check or a strike, the employer could voluntarily recognize the bargaining unit as a representative of its employees and negotiate with it. And so even though voluntary recognition is rare, it is increasing in use by some unions. Either by publicity, picketing, friendly politicians, or boycotts, these unions are pressuring employers into recognizing a union without an election. And so then we talked about this other method by which a union may be certified to represent employees, and that's by a National Labor Relations Board directives. Now, these cases are rare, and they only occur in situations where the NLRB has determined that an impartial election in which employees can express their free choice is not possible. The cases usually involve employer interference in a secret ballot election that makes holding a second fair and impartial election unrealistic. Such NLRB directives are called a GISL bargaining order based on a landmark 1969 case. In this case, the court gave a stamp of approval for authorization cards as a substitute for an election where an employer's actions amounted to an unfair labor practice. The court recognized that if traditional remedies could not eradicate the lingering effects of the employer's conduct and permit the holding of a fair election, the union's authorization cards were a more reliable indicator of the employee's desires than an election, and a bargaining order should be known or issued. Known as the Giselle Doctrine, the board is strictly limited in imposing a Giselle bargaining order to cases in which the union actually gained majority status through the organization or authorization cards. Regardless of how outrageous the employer's actions, unless such a majority is demonstrated, no order to bargain can be issued. And so then we talk about the prohibited conduct during an election. And this prohibited conduct includes actions such as campaign propaganda and misrepresentation. So campaign rhetoric by either side is routinely ignored because it's part of any election campaign and usually will be disregarded by employees in making the decision. But the NLRB would intervene in cases in which forgery or misleading information is rendered in such a way that the voters are unable to discern the propagandistic nature of the publication. Threats and loss of benefits. Unlike mere campaign rhetoric, the actual reduction or withholding of benefits or the direct threats of economic reprisals as a method of combating an organizational drive is prohibited. The promise of economic benefits by the employer if employees reject unionization will violate the National Labor Relations Act, as will the promise or grant of economic benefits during an organizational campaign to influence the outcome of an election or to discourage organizational activities. And then this idea of interrogation and polling of employees. So absent unusual circumstances, the polling of employees by an employer is prohibited unless the following safeguards, including the purpose of the poll is to determine the truth of the union's claim of majority. Then this purpose is communicated to the employees, assurances against reprisals are given, and the employees are polled by secret ballots, and the employer has not engaged in unfair labor practices or otherwise created a coercive atmosphere. And then finally, we have this issue about decertification elections. So this is also allowed under the Act, and it's supervised by the NLRB. And this is whereby members of the unit vote to terminate an existing unit's right to represent them in collective bargaining. The NLRB honors a bar to a decertification election within the first year of representation after a secret vote election to give a new union time to reach agreement with the employees. And so this decertification vote couldn't happen within the first year because it does take time to get this, to get the all the provisions of a collective bargaining agreement taken care of. So the rules for the decertification election are similar to those for certification, with some exceptions. Only employees can file a decertification petition, and that must include 30% of the eligible members of a unit. Again, the NLRB investigates the validity of the petition if the union feels there's a problem with the petition or that the employer has unlawfully helped in getting the petition, it may file a blocking charge and delay the election until the unfair labor charge is resolved. Similar to the majority of employees signing recognition cards, the NLRB has accepted a petition to decertify a union signed by more than 50% of the employees in the unit without an actual election. And so this points to some of the factors present in situations in which unions are decertified. So why would workers vote to decertify their unions? And so perhaps the employers recently treated employees better. Perhaps the employer waged an aggressive anti-union campaign. Perhaps the employer moves to a traditional non-union geographic area. Perhaps the union is perceived by a majority of its members as being unresponsive, or perhaps female, minority, and younger workers lose confidence in the union because of its declining public image and aging leaders. And so there are several reasons why a union could be decertified. And some of these reasons could often be used by management as a way to start that or to kind of initiate that process. So again, these are just a few more reasons that we just talked about. So then we talk about representation elections in the public sector. So although modeled after private sector campaign, union elections conducted in the public sector have some differences. Public sector employees may not be able to prohibit non-employee union agents access to the workplace because the workplace is a public area. Rules governing public employer pre-election activities during an organizational campaign generally mirror private sector restrictions, although some state and local governments have encouraged less restrictive standards. In effect, this approach balances the employer's right of free speech with its duty to not be coercive. When a union is recognized as an exclusive bargaining agent for the unit of employees, two major issues come into play. One is exclusive representation, and so this is both a practice and a principle of law, and it predates the practice predates the law. As we talked about earlier, the roots of labor management relationships depended on the workers' agreement to join together to make demands on the employer. Without such solidarity, employers would have gone to other workers willing to work for what the employer wanted to pay. And so this completes our review of Chapter 4 and with respect to establishing a bargaining unit and the organizing campaign. And so clearly there are some very specific and strict guidelines or rules and regulations that are in effect that limit both the employee, the union, and the employer's actions and activities during an organizing campaign. And so it's important that from an HR perspective we understand what these are and know what to watch for so that we can be sure that, one, we're not allowing, if we're the employer, we're not allowing something unfair to us to happen by either the union or by employees, and then vice versa. If we're the employees, we don't want the employers, through coercive or other unfair measures that are prohibited, to influence the outcome of what we're trying to do. And so I would read the chapter again, make sure you're familiar with these, and can move on into the discussion questions and the exercises and assignments. And thanks for your time on this.